Hello and welcome to Lecture 3 on Chapter 3. So now we're going to talk about the cerebral cortex. We've talked about the brainstem, we've talked about subcortical structures. Now we're going to talk about the rest of the brain that surrounds those subcortical structures, and that's called the cerebral cortex. So we're going to look at each of these four lobes and then the various cortexes on various lobes. So each of the lobes plays a very specific role. Each part of the brain has a job, has a responsibility. For the frontal lobe, so our frontal lobe separates here, it's all of this part of the brain. That's your frontal lobe. Frontal lobe is for higher executive functioning. It's for higher level thinking. Your ability to be self-aware, to have a sense of self, and that sense of self is continuous from day to day. It controls planning, reasoning, understanding of risks and consequences, initiative, responsibility, puts emotions together, also is responsible for voluntary motion, and it integrates info from other brain areas. So in the last lecture, I was talking about how with memory, hippocampus is taking care of the story of the memory. The amygdala is taking responsibility for the emotion that goes with that memory. Now, in order to integrate that information, the hippocampus and the amygdala have to send that information to the frontal lobe, and the frontal lobe will solve the puzzle. And that puzzle gives you your memory. Okay, so here we've got our frontal cortex, our frontal lobe, and now we've got our parietal lobe, which is specific for touch and sensation. So our parietal lobe is right here. So it's your ability to sense when something touches you, even if it's very slight, is because of your parietal lobe. It's interpreting that sensory information from your skin, from your nerve endings. It detects temperature, pressure, information from muscles and joints. So the parietal lobe is all about somatosensory information, specifically physical touch. It also helps us understand spatial relations, where things are in space and how they all come together. Then we get to the temporal lobe. The temporal lobe is right here above the ear. So with each of these lobes, you have two of them, because the brain, you've actually got two brains. You've got the right hemisphere and the left hemisphere. And they are fused together by a part of the brain I'll talk about in a little bit. But in truth, you've got two frontal lobes, two parietal lobes, two temporal lobes, and two occipital lobes, but we're not to those lobes yet. So with the temporal lobe, these are responsible for hearing and speech. Wernicke's area, let me show you Wernicke's area, is right here on the temporal lobe. So Wernicke's area is responsible for your ability to understand what others are saying to you. And this is it's located on the left temporal lobe. So it's only on the left temporal lobe. It is not on the right. It's only on the left temporal lobe. The left brain is much more language-based. So Wernicke's is responsible for speech comprehension. Broca's area is involved with your ability to produce speech. And that's on the left frontal lobe. I'll show you that. So here we have Broca's area. So this, we've got a not greatly preserved brain, but as you can see here, massive tissue death in this part of the brain. And that's Broca's area. This is the brain of a patient who had an enormous stroke. That stroke just killed off that tissue right there. And that left the patient with the inability to produce speech. Doesn't mean they couldn't produce sounds. They just couldn't form words, and they couldn't put words together. If you have damage to your Wernicke's area, speech comprehension, right here, when people are talking to you, it's going to sound like gibberish. Your brain won't be able to interpret what is being said. It can't put the language together in a cohesive manner. So Wernicke's area is necessary for speech understanding. Broca's is responsible for speech production. Now, the temporal lobe is critical for processing auditory information, but it also plays a role in memory and in our perception of objects and faces. There's a specialized area on the temporal lobe called the fusiform face area. And it's this part right here in pink. So right now we're looking at the brain from the bottom up. So here's your frontal lobe, and here's your temporal lobe from the bottom. The fusiform gyrus is the part of the brain that interprets faces. And if you think about it, faces are really odd. We don't really encounter anything really as complicated as the face. Just from a visual perspective, we've got animals and we recognize their faces too, but in order to identify other people, to be able to put their faces together and understand that that's a person, you need the fusiform gyrus. And so this is the part of the temporal lobe, and it's more active when looking at faces versus looking at other objects. Our brain has to work really hard when we look at faces, because faces tell us a lot. We're not just identifying the person, but we're reading their emotion. And emotion is complicated. Then we get to the occipital lobe, and this is vision. This is your primary visual pathway. So it's right back here. So, as I mentioned, on each lobe there are cortexes. And so I want to look at some of the cortexes. First we have the primary somatosensory cortex, and this processes sensory information. It's on the temporal lobe. So, I'm sorry, that should say parietal lobe. Please cross that out, and it should say parietal lobe. I'm sorry. So the primary somatosensory cortex is on the parietal lobe. It's right here in lilac. That's your primary somatosensory cortex. On the frontal lobe, you have the primary motor cortex here in light blue. And the primary motor cortex processes movement. And it forms what's called the homunculus, the somatosensory and motor homunculus. This fascinates me. So, on each of these cortexes, you're going to see that different parts of the body are mapped out on that cortex. So here we've got the motor cortex. The more a part of the body moves, the more tissue on that cortex that is dedicated to that movement. So your face moves constantly, even in your sleep. You can tell if someone's having a disturbing dream just by looking at their facial reactions. We show emotion in our sleep, but our faces are moving constantly. Our elbow, it just is pretty much a hinge. It doesn't need a lot of tissue. It doesn't need a lot of this motor cortex to help control it. So this motor cortex controls voluntary motion. somatosensory cortex has to do with sensation, with your experiencing the sensations that your brain is receiving from sensory organs. And it's the same concept. So the more sensitive a part of the body, the more tissue designated to that part of the body on the somatosensory cortex. Your face is incredibly sensitive. Your hands are very sensitive. Your elbow, not so much. Yeah, it hurts when you bang it, but it doesn't have nearly the number of nerve endings that your lips do, or your cheeks. What's interesting is that if you look at that, you can see how there's a lot of overlap. So, if you close that like a sandwich, the face and the face area on the somatosensory cortex is where the face area is on the motor cortex. So this is our homunculus. And I found some really weird sculptures of what the human body would look like if parts of the body were to scale as if it was on the homunculus. Here's your motor homunculus. I know it's creepy. It is. But I think for me it really solidifies the information that on my motor homunculus, it's all about hands and it's all about face. Those are the two things that we move the most. And with hand movement, we have very fine motor skills. We're very agile using fine motor skills. And speech also requires fine motor skills. And here we have the sensory homunculus. Again, huge hands and a huge head. Especially with the sensory homunculus, especially the mouth. So these are some of the most sensitive areas on the body. As I said, your elbow doesn't really get much. Now, I mentioned that the two hemispheres of the brain are joined together by a specific structure, and that structure is called the corpus callosum. And we have it right here, this structure right here. It's a very dense and fibrous tissue. So right here we're looking down from the top of the brain down. If I take a sliver out, this is the corpus callosum. So you have this band that joins the two hemispheres. Interestingly, you still have space between from the top of the corpus callosum to the top of the cerebral cortex. So, let's see. The corpus callosum is the pathway that allows both hemispheres of the brain to communicate with each other. We talked about contralateral organization in the first lecture, about how the right side of the brain controls the left side of the body, and the left brain controls the right side of the body. This is part of that process. So the corpus callosum allows each hemisphere to talk to each other. Just check my next slide. Something that's interesting is they find, so when they've done research, they find that women actually use both hemispheres of their brain for language. Most of it is left hemisphere. But women use a little bit of the right hemisphere as well. Men only use the left hemisphere. Now, something that's also interesting is, so I talked about how this is a very dense and fibrous tissue. The corpus callosum is denser in women. And we are better multitaskers. Now, we are horrific multitaskers. Every person is a horrific multitasker. It's just that women are minutely less bad at it. And it's because of differences in the cerebral cortex, the corpus callosum. Okay, see you on lecture 4.